Internet. Charlie Roisman, I think, and no, it was Charlie Summers.
Charlie's right there.
Charlie, good, you are here. Okay. Charlie, tell us how you discovered us and why you're here.
Well, I'm here to see Mr. Edwards. I've known Jack and there's a whole bunch of people in this room for a long time from the FOTR convention, but I had to find out about it from someone in Colorado.
You're really publicizing the club, aren't you, Jack?
What he's referring to is Stuart Wright, one of our members in Colorado, passed on to him the bulletin we sent out this week on Bob Edwards coming.
What you should be doing, Jack, is posting it to the digest.
I had no idea people would come from Pennsylvania. I guess we'll put it on the digest now. For those of you who don't know, Charlie's the webmaster of the OTR Digest, which is the biggest old-time radio. I call it a bulletin board. It's not, though. It's a mailing discussion group on the internet. And see Charlie if you want to get the citation for it after.
Any other guests, new people, someone who'd like to introduce themselves and tell us how they found out about our club? Yes, sir.
Well, I brought my wife Patricia with me tonight for the first time.
Patricia?
And how did she find out about it?
Yes, sir.
Brooks Tegler, I'm local band leader, musician, actor, person. And actually I had a wonderful chat with Michael Henry over at his day gig one afternoon. I was snooping out some scripts and he told me about it and invited me down. I'm happy to be here.
Right. Your father does some radio production too.
Yeah. Him too.
Right. Have to get him. Yes, sir, in the back.
Rich Miller, I broke the sweetheart Ceci.
Good. Welcome, Ceci. Oh, very good.
It's going to be the first meeting I've ever been to where none of the people said that they came because Ed.
The guy sitting in front of you?
Yeah.
Well, what we'll do next is Michael is going to introduce our guest. After that, we'll take a break and people can talk and rent some CDs and cassettes. Then we'll get together for a short business meeting and they can be entertaining too. So if you can stay, you'd learn a little bit more about our club and maybe you'd want to join or maybe not. But so next, Michael, please. We're starting off our fall seasons. We always start off with a big bang, and this is it. September is the beginning of the year.
Yeah, why are you up?
And we have a wonderful guest.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. I'm really pleased to start off the fall season of the Radio Club meetings with a very special guest who has written a new book on one of the pioneers in broadcast journalism, Edward R. Murrow, whose career I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. But our guest has a very distinguished career of his own in broadcasting. He started his career at WHEL in New Albany, Indiana. He was a TV news anchor man with American Forces Network in Korea. He came to Washington. He was an anchor man for WTOP Radio. He earned a master's degree in broadcast journalism from American University under the tutelage of Ed Bliss, who also worked with Edward R. Murrow. And in 1974, he joined NPR as co-host for All Things Considered with Susan Stamberg. And then 5 years later, in 1979, he began a 25-year stint as the host of Morning Edition. And in that 25 years, he hosted and interviewed over 20,000 people on the show, including weekly interviews with the legendary sports broadcaster Red Barber from 1981 to 1992, which he chronicled in his book Fridays with Red. And over those 25 years, he's won several awards, including in 1984, the Edward R. Murrow Award from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, In 1987, the Gabriel Award from the National Catholic Association of Broadcasters, and another one from that same organization in 1990. In 1995, the Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University Award. In 1999, he won the George Foster Peabody Award for his work on Morning Edition. And just this year, he was inducted into the Radio Hall of Fame by the Museum of Broadcast Communications in Chicago, joining the likes of Edward R. Murrow and Lowell Thomas. And beginning on October 4th, this coming month, you will hear him on his own morning program on XM satellite radio. And I will encourage him to talk about that as well tonight. And after his presentation, there's a representative here from Borders Bookstores, and she has copies of the book here for sale, and Bob will be doing a book signing. So I think you'll enjoy that opportunity. So without further ado, please welcome me in joining Bob Edwards.
That's something. See what kind of technician was? Oh, it's yours. I'm sorry. I thought we were doing audio.
Those switches on? Okay.
I don't know. Do you have anything? Do you have, there you go. How's it sound? Okay? Well, I'm sure you recognize that as an NPR program you were listening to. My former employer will be happy to sell you that program if you want copies of that. My current employer, I'm sure you all also know that one of the many, many channels that XM satellite radio has is devoted to old-time radio. In addition to that, there are decades channels. There's the 40s on Channel 4, the 50s on Channel 5, the 60s on Channel 6. I can't get my mother-in-law off of the 40s. So on the 40s, for example, you would hear, Sammy Kaye, Glenn Miller, Helen O'Connell, and why would she leave that? So anyway, there's something there for all of you in addition to this public radio channel, XMPR, which is already on without me. Programs from Public Radio International, American Public Media, WBUR in Boston. And my program will begin October 4th. It'll be an hour interview program produced out of XM, which is over near Union Station. The one thing I wanted to tell you about XM is that even though it's the future of radio and the whole plant, if you took the tour, and you should, it's visually stunning. The whole thing looks like a science fiction set with parts of it literally modeled after Star Trek. So even though there's all that future there, it's an outfit that honors the, 84 years that radio's been around, with these large photographs, for example, of the radio stars of all these decades. The studios are named after Mel Blanc and Stravinsky and anyone else who ever did anything of any note on radio. The area where you go into my area, which is the Bob Edwards Show, you go through this portal down a hallway, and on either side of that portal, you have on the left a huge poster-sized photograph of Red Barber at a WHN microphone. And then on the other side, on the right side, is a similar-sized photograph of Edward R. Murrow, the two guys I wrote books about. And that's when I was here last, 9 years ago, to talk about Red Barber, who was hired by Edward R. Murrow, by the way, to be the director of sports for CBS. Red claimed that he was the first person Murrow hired when Murrow went to the management of CBS News in New York. So he was always very proud of that. So Murrow, he was Egbert Roscoe Murrow, born in Polecat Creek, North Carolina, and I've been there. And I want to tell you, talking about humble beginnings. Fortunately, I didn't see any polecats, but the house is still there. It's a ruin. In fact, the property looks so bad that the North Carolina Department of Highways took their sign down, their roadside marker. They didn't want to draw any attention to this thing. Anyway, he was his father was a small farmer in North Carolina, and his heart wasn't in it, and they got out of there when Murrow was just 5 and went off to the state of Washington, where Ed Murrow's father worked in the lumber camps, worked on a railroad, was an engineer on a little railroad that served the sawmills and the lumber camps of the state of Washington. And that's how Ed grew up. He worked in those sawmills and lumber camps in the summers, and in the year between high school and college, he took a year off to work in the lumber camps. So he was a working class kid and always kept that perspective his whole life. You know, he was the champion of the underdog. He knew what hard work was, and I could read you excerpts from his broadcasts from the Blitz in London. He was talking about a lot more than Churchill and Parliament and the King. He would tell you what the shop girl had told him about her experience in the war, the woman that drove the ambulance, the cop on the beat, the pensioner, as they call them in England. And he kept that common perspective throughout his life. He was a big man on campus, both high school and college. He was a debater, a champion debater, and I think that probably served him very well for his later life. But he did everything. You know, he was the star actor in the school play. He was president of the student body. He played basketball. Everything. He was ROTC colonel. Everything he was in, he led. And I think he was just one of those guys, maybe your club is like this, you know. It's not that they lust for power or anything, but you know they'll get the job done. So you elect them president and have them lead. And these same people lead everything they're about. And Murrow was like that. But clearly he was somebody driven to be somebody. Whatever he would have done, whatever field he would have gone into, he would have had an impact. And it was sort of accidental that he became a broadcaster. He seemed bent toward education. He was president of the National Student Federation, coming out of his being college president at Washington State College, as it was called then. And then worked for the Institute of International Education, the education arm of the Carnegie Endowment. Today they sponsor the Fulbright scholarships, for example. In those days they were mostly about exchange programs between Europe and the United States. And Murrow was involved in that. And then he heard about an opening at CBS. And CBS was still very, very young then. This was 1935. And the position was director of talks. And they had talks on the radio in those days. This would be arranging speeches by political leaders, labor leaders, business leaders, ministers, and they would just get on and talk. And that was sort of education. So Murrow went into that and wanted to know what this radio thing was about. And he thought maybe that could be used for educational purposes too. They made him director of European operations in 1937. And again, he was not to go on the air. This was, again, he was a facilitator. If CBS wanted to talk to someone in Europe, Murrow arranged it. Or if they wanted a live broadcast, and all broadcasts, by the way, were live in those days, they weren't allowed to use tape. Well, there wasn't tape anyway. They weren't allowed to record. I had to keep reminding myself when I was writing the book, don't say tape. There was no tape. I'm so used to saying, well, we taped a broadcast. No. You record a broadcast. The reasoning there was that CBS felt that its mission was to give you live programming. That if they played a record of Paul Whiteman, there would be no need for a network. The local station could play that record for you. You could play a record in your house. Why would you need a network? So they applied the same logic to news. So every time you heard Murrow or any of his fabulous team of reporters during the war, you were hearing them live up until D-Day. They finally changed their little rule on D-Day. Anyway, Murrow was in Europe and arranging broadcasts of children's choirs and other types of things like that. When war was looking to Murrow like it was inevitable. You know, the Nazis were building this war machine and just looked very menacing as Churchill was trying to tell his country that this was coming. And Murrow, who was not a journalist, thought he needed a little help in that area, and he hired William L. Shirer, who was a veteran newspaper and wire service reporter. But again, Shirer wasn't supposed to go on the air either. He was supposed to arrange broadcasts by other journalists, which was, of course, very insulting to Shirer, who felt he could do the job himself. But there was no permanent overseas team of reporters. And what made that necessary, of course, was the final outbreak of war. So in 1938, when Hitler annexed Austria, there was this very compelling story to tell, and Murrow and Shirer were kind of forced onto the air. They became de facto foreign correspondents for CBS at that point. And as the war spread, Murrow hired many others, whose names you know: Richard C. Hodelet, Howard K. Smith, Eric Severide, Winston Burdett, Bill Downs, just a fabulous, fabulous group of people. Charles Collingwood. Murrow hired people for their brains, not for their pretty voices. And not all of them had pretty voices. Shirer's certainly wasn't pretty. New York hated Severide's voice. I don't know why, I thought it was fine. And Murrow kind of enjoyed that. He had a big conflict with Paul White, who was running CBS News back in New York. And they were rivals, Murrow and White. And if White didn't like the sound of somebody's voice, that was a plus as far as Murrow was concerned, and he would hire him. Murrow also did another thing. He was ahead of his time in hiring women. He hired a woman whom I met and interviewed some years ago, named Mary Marvin Breckenridge. And she covered Holland for the CBS News team, and had some other breakthroughs. She broke some stories. But when she left to marry a diplomat, and the State Department didn't want to have one of its diplomats married to a journalist, so she had to quit. And he wanted to replace her with another woman, and CBS in New York told him no. They didn't want to hear women. No women's voices. So yes, journalism was very late. The broadcast journalism was very late in arriving at equal opportunity for women, but Murrow was trying to do his part back in the 30s and 40s. Where Murrow really stood out, of course, was his base in London, reporting on the Blitz, the German bombardment of Britain, from the streets and from the rooftops. The guy was absolutely fearless. He was afraid that, he was not afraid, I go right into he was afraid. He feared that if he went into the bomb shelters, he would get used to them and would never be above ground again to report. So he only went down there to do an interview a couple of times and then stayed above ground. He wanted to go to the rooftop, and the British military didn't want him to do that. They thought that that radio signal would act as some kind of a beacon, some kind of a honing device to direct German bombing. Churchill realized that with Britain virtually alone against the Nazis, Murrow was reaching the people he wanted to reach, America. He wanted some help. He wanted America to know what Britain was up against, and he facilitated Murrow's going to the rooftops and cut through that red tape that the British military was clogging Murrow's plans with. They're very dramatic broadcasts. I'm sure you've heard one or two of them. His, with a blackout, you know, he can't be reading a script. He is, I'm sure, working off some notes that he made during the day, but mostly it's just ad lib. He's describing what he sees, and you hear what he hears. Bombs. This was novel in 1940. People weren't used to hearing a war, a real war, not gangbusters, but a real war in their living rooms. That had to be very impressive. You heard the air raid whistles of the policemen and the air raid wardens. You heard the sirens. You heard the anti-aircraft fire. All very dramatic stuff. Of course, it was the wee hours of the morning in Britain. It would have been, you know, 7 p.m. or thereabouts here in the East. And the courage that he showed was just extraordinary. And I got to give you a little taste of the kinds of scripted things he actually did when he would come down off the rooftop. By the way, he was on the roof of the BBC, a broadcasting house, which got hit a bunch of times. But fortunately not while he was up there. It got hit once when he was in the building. They broadcast from the sub-basement of the BBC. And the bomb came through the window, about, I don't know, 5 or 6 stories up, and just lay there. And they had some of their unexploded bomb experts come in and work on it, and then it went off. And killed a lot of Murrell's friends that day, but he was in the sub-basement. And
was that his closest call?
no, there were other times when he would dive into the gutter, walking the streets. He walked the streets with Bill Paley when Bill Paley visited, his boss, you know. And Paley was just amazed at, you know, that this was the way people lived in London. Larry Lesueur, who was another one of his reporters, could also walk those streets with him and was equally brave. Severide didn't care for this at all and went home. Went home and did a broadcast out of New York for a while, and then came back later in the war. And but this is the type of thing he was doing when he wasn't on the roof. One night I stood in front of a smashed grocery store and heard a dripping inside. It was the only sound in all London. 2 cans of peaches had been drilled clean through by flying glass, and the juice was dripping down onto the floor. See, I love these word pictures. You know, you can see all of this. In one window, or what used to be a window, was a sign. It read, "Shattered, but not shuttered." Nearby was another shop displaying a crudely lettered sign reading, "Knocked, but not locked." They were both doing business in the open air. Halfway down the block, there was a desk on the sidewalk. A man sat behind it with a pile of notes at his elbow. He was paying off the staff of the store that stood there yesterday. But here's my favorite, because this gets back to Murrell's working class upbringing. We looked in on a renowned Mayfair hotel tonight and found many old dowagers and retired colonels settling back on the overstuffed settees in the lobby. It was not the sort of protection I'd seek from a direct hit from a half-ton bomb. But if you were a retired colonel and his lady, you might feel that the risk was worth it, because you would at least be bombed with the right sort of people. And you could always get a drink if you were a resident of the hotel. I love stuff like that. He flew 15 combat missions during the war, flying over Berlin. He won his first Peabody for a broadcast he did called, alternately called D-Dog, which was the code name of the RAF bomber he was in, and Orchestrated Hell, which is how he described the Berlin that he saw below him. And it's very dramatic broadcast because they're caught in the searchlights at one point, and the pilot has to take evasive action, and they're being thrown everywhere, and he describes all of this. You know. So it's not just what he sees and hears, but also what he feels.
Now, was he broadcasting that live
No,
on the radio?
no, you couldn't, no. He went back to London, thank God, because a lot of people didn't, and then sat down and wrote from whatever notes he could make while he was up there. So I don't think they had, I don't know, Red Barber did a broadcast from a plane in the 30s, but I'm not sure the technology would have stretched to over Berlin at that point.
For the most part, they had to be within a wire distance of
Yeah.
the transmitter.
Yeah, and there was shortwave from, you know, the technical arrangements of broadcasts in those days was extraordinary. Half the time these guys were never heard. Their best work just went out into the ether. They had to let New York know that they were going to be at a transmitting station at a given time speaking. And what Paul White back in New York did was hire a worldwide network of ham operators. Or not hire them, but kept them on some sort of retainer, you know, so that they would be monitoring, listening for a CBS correspondent to say, this is Charles Collingwood, I'm in Algeria, and I will be broadcasting tonight at 1700 hours. And they would pass that information on to Paul White, and then you know, Bob Trout or whoever was on the air in New York would say, we interrupt this program, or such and such program will not be heard tonight. Instead, we go to Charles Collingwood reporting from Algiers. And they would just open it up and hope he'd be there. Short wave. Now maybe Charles changed his mind, you know. I mean, Charles was a dude, you know. He was, something could come up with Charles. You know? He was, his lifestyle matched his fabulous reporting. Anyway, that's how they did it. And there was atmospheric conditions, sunspots. And so sometimes they're talking away, but they're not being heard by us here.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard recordings and it fades in and
Yeah,
out.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like the ocean.
Yeah.
And the short wave, that's how they had to work. And just what they had to go through to put on that first roundup back in '38 when Murrow and Shirer are reporting on the annexation of Austria. They did that in 6 hours, negotiating with all these capitals because there was multiple points of origin. Vienna, London, Paris. They tried to get Italy and they couldn't, and of course Berlin. And they had to bribe some engineers in each of these places to open up on a Sunday. Imagine trying to get something done on a Sunday in Italy in 1938. They had to deal with censorship. They had to deal with so much stuff. And today we've got toys. We've got sat radios we can just carry around in our hand. It's just anyway. Where was I? I was in the war.
Well, did the government in England make them shut their transmitters down at certain times because of the thought that it would be picked up by the enemy or anything?
No, I don't think so. Because of course the BBC was operating too at that time, and both NBC and CBS were using the BBC building for their broadcasts.
And is that where the transmitters and antennas were too?
Yes. And Murrow's counterpart for NBC was Fred Bate, who took a hit out in front of the BBC. Lost part of his ear, had tendons in both legs cut, and he's crawling, trying to get into the BBC with the script in hand. I love this side of this. And they patched him up and sent him home. That was the competition Murrow was up against. Murrow, of course, had other very important broadcasts. He was at Buchenwald, the liberation of Buchenwald, and his broadcast from that is just stunning because he is so angry. It's a whole different kind of broadcast. He is just furious because the Germans living in the villages around Buchenwald looked like they hadn't been in the war. They were well-fed and looking happy and healthy, and just over the fence, it's just the worst that man can do to his fellow man. Yeah, oh, it was on tape. Yeah, and it's in the book. The transcript is in the book, part of it. And do read that. It cost me $400 to. And anyway, and after the war, he was. They had this. They built up such capital of goodwill for their wartime broadcasts, that Murrow was just really riding so high at this point. And Paley insisted that he become in overall charge of CBS News and become an executive in New York. And he hated it. He did it for about a year or so, put on some fabulous new programs, hired magnificent post-war staff of Daniel Shore and David Schonbrun and Alexander Kendrick and a whole bunch of great people. But he longed for the air again, so he went back on CBS Radio and did a long-running nightly newscast that was, the kind of the broadcast of record in the evening, about 7:45, something like that, 15-minute broadcast. And that's when Ed Bliss, my mentor, was writing for him. And quite a bit of this book has to do with Ed Bliss's stories that he told me over the years about Murrow, because Bliss and I were buddies for 30 years after he taught me at American University in graduate school, and up until his death last year. And the great shame is that I didn't call him up immediately and tell him I was going to do this book, and 2 weeks later he died. And I wish I could have shared this with him, but anyway. Of course, what came next was television, and Murrow was a pioneer there too, along with his co-producer Fred Friendly. You had television news. Doug Edwards had been doing the CBS Evening News since '48, but it was headlines and day-old film, or in some cases, if it came from overseas, week-old film. And Cronkite says Doug Edwards was fond of using the word recently. Like here is film of a demonstration in Paris recently. So what they didn't have was original material, stuff you couldn't find in the New York Times, original reporting by a CBS News staff. And that's what See It Now did in 1951. And of course, 3 years later, their famous McCarthy broadcast, which was instrumental in bringing McCarthy down, although McCarthy did a much better job of that himself, bringing himself down. And that was also the beginning of the end of Murrow, to tell you the truth, that broadcast. Because it was one of the biggest among many fights that he had with Bill Paley, who ran CBS. Because Murrow's broadcasts were just too hot, too controversial for television. See, no one objected when he was doing his wartime reporting, but the television reporting was controversial, and sponsors hate controversy. Sponsors don't want controversy. Sponsors want everybody to be happy and go out and buy the product. So Murrow did this McCarthy broadcast in '54. 2 years after that, he lost his sponsor, Alcoa. 2 years after that, he lost his program. And 2 years after that, he was out at CBS. Paley said to Murrow, your programs give me stomach aches. And Murrow told him, well, they go with the job. And Paley didn't think they went with the job. Paley ran the network. He defined the job. So that was the original clash of journalistic values and corporate values. And because that fight was fought by Murrow at that time, no one really has bothered to fight it since. We know how that's going to turn out. They own the store. Corporate values and interests are going to trump journalistic values and interests every time. So Murrow went down in a flame of glory. He gave this speech to the Radio Television News Directors Association, in which he just ripped his own industry. And all he was doing really was saying that you had all this escapist programming of the time, and could not television just once in a while devote a piece of prime time to the discussion of public affairs? That's all. And of course now we have that. But what's changed is, in Murrow's day, news didn't have to make money. They did it as a lost leader. They did it out of goodwill. They did it because they thought it needed doing. And now everything has changed. The news division has to make money just like the sports division and the entertainment division. And the only way you make money putting a news program on in prime time is to have it look like an entertainment program. And that's what we've got. You know, you get the interview with the starlet on your network who's plugging that show. You get the disease of the week. I always like that. The thing that's going to kill you is that. We used to do that during sweeps week in local television. Now we do it in prime time. The mold in your basement that's going to kill you. The germs on the doorknobs that you've been in. And crime. Crime. We were, Lacey Peterson, Kobe. We're big on crime. Celebrity crime, even better. And that kind of stuff keeps me in radio, ladies and gentlemen. Anyway, Murrow died in '65. I was a senior in high school, and all my life I wanted to be Murrow. Or, I mean, look at that picture. Look at that picture. Would you not think that's the coolest thing? I mean, when I was a little kid in the 50s, I couldn't understand a word. He was talking about NATO and Eisenhower. I don't know any of that. But he looked cool. Looked cool. And later on, of course, I came to realize what he was all about and what he meant. And then I really had to do this for a living. He died in '65. He was 57 years, 2 days old. Of course, you've seen all the pictures. He smoked constantly on camera and died of lung cancer, which spread to his brain. 4 packs a day, which I smoke, and I would think it impossible to do 4 packs a day. It would be every waking moment. You would only be not smoking when you were asleep.
Cigarettes were short.
Oh, and he did. Well, check this out. He did 2 programs on health issues involved in cigarettes, smoking through both of them, of course. But he did them in 1954. 10 years before the Surgeon General. I mean, he was just ahead of everybody.
Wasn't that about the time that Arthur Godfrey came down with lung cancer?
Maybe a little bit later, because I remember that so well. He always got involved in equal time issues, because you had an equal time provision in those days, and Paley was constantly giving up an hour of See It Now to counter something Murrow had done. And it got ridiculous at one point. He did a program on agribusiness and small farmers. The thing that we were all crazy about, 10, 15 years ago, he was doing in the 50s. And the objection was raised by the Secretary of Agriculture, Ezra Taft Benson. This was 1956, to be exact, because it was an election year. So Paley gave Benson an hour, no, a half hour. See It Now was a half hour. And Benson gets on and doesn't talk about the small farmer. He does a half-hour commercial for Ike. It's an election year. Now, 2 Democrats object to Benson doing the commercial, and they gave them a half hour. Now, what's lost is the small farmer. Hey, we're back here. So, that's when Murrow said, I can't do this anymore if you just keep doing that. And he says, well, you don't have to. That was the end of the program. Anyway, that's Murrow's story. So now you don't have to read the book.
After he left radio, he went to work for the government.
Yes, the USIA. Yeah. And tried to, he had a guarantee that he was going to be at every National Security Council meeting and every cabinet meeting, but he wasn't. They reneged on the promise. So he learned about the Bay of Pigs through another reporter, and he was furious about it. He was not a good administrator. He couldn't suck up to Congress, which you have to do to get your budget, and he just couldn't do that. And then when he didn't get what he wanted in the budget, he went out and made speeches about this chairman, this awful guy who won't give me, you know, you just don't do that in this time. You know? So he was dead meat there. He just, you know, reporters are just not cut out to do that. Make nice with Congress. Anyway, well, y'all want to know. Yeah.
Actually, can you go into more detail about his relationship with Paley? What was that relationship?
Well, they were tight. They were close friends during the war, and then it all fell apart in the television era. But Murrow always had a direct pipeline to Paley, which also worked against him because, you know, if he takes everything to Paley, he's bypassing the Sig Mickelson, who is in charge of TV at CBS. He was in charge of everything but Murrow. The See It Now crew could do an end run on Mickelson. And Frank Stanton, the president of CBS, he resented this too. You know, what? I'm the president, and I'm not in charge of this guy. What is this? So he had this benefactor in Paley until it just got to be too much for Paley. You know, he was doing these controversial programs that were not only upsetting sponsors, but also people on the Hill, the FCC, and this was just causing grief for Paley. You know, in those days, the FCC actually regulated, so unlike today's FCC, they facilitate.
My stepfather was pretty strongly influenced by Murrow. He was a Jesuit CBS correspondent for about 25 years. What do you think if Murrow were to step through that door right now and address the graduating journalism class in 2004? What would he tell them?
It depends. Has he seen television of late?
I guess that would be my question.
Has he?
What would he think of what he sees now?
Has he seen the Times and Post apologies for pre-war Iraq stories? If he has seen all that, I think those students would really get an earful. I don't think he'd work in the business. I don't think he could function unless he had his own cable channel, the Murrow channel.
There you go.
And if he ran it, you know, but he would have to run it. I think he would like a lot of stuff. He would like C-SPAN.
Really?
Sure. He would be a C-SPAN junkie. He would like 60 Minutes. And I know he would like public radio. Bill Moyers, McNeil Lehrer. I still say McNeil Lehrer, and it's only Lehrer. And you know, Nightline, Sunday morning on CBS. But these primetime magazines, I think, would just drive him, you know, up the wall. And the shout shows on the cable channels. He would expect the cable news channels to actually cover news in prime time instead of doing these testosterone programs. Whoever shouts loudest wins.
That's right.
Well, with that in mind, how did he feel doing person-to-person?
Yes, for every Murrow rule, there is an exception, and that's a biggie. It was, of course, an outright entertainment program. It was the predecessor of the Barbara Walters star Schmooze. In fact, it makes Barbara Walters look like a district attorney. You know, it was so. If you saw one of these now, you would laugh out loud. Murrow talking to a celebrity who is giving Murrow a vicarious tour of the house, the apartment, wherever. Murrow's in a studio. We are, of course, watching this. And the star takes you into the living room and shows you the art above the mantel, which I always suspected was borrowed for the occasion. And the bowling trophies were put in the closet for, you know, but you know, it's just fluff, total fluff. But it made him money, and he owned it ultimately. He owned half of it at first, and then bought out his partners, who were his radio writers, Johnny Aaron and Jesse Salzmer. It was their idea to start this program. He bought them out and owned the whole thing and then sold it to Paley and made quite a bit of money. His idea was that this would bring an audience to his serious stuff, that person-to-person audience would then come over and watch See It Now. Whether they did or not, I don't know. But, yeah.
Did you say in the book that they teamed Murrow with Cronkite in the
Oh, yeah.
56 election?
Yeah, it was 56 or 60. Cronkite was anchoring, and Don Hewitt had this idea. Oh yeah, it must have been 56 because they were getting killed by Huntley and Brinkley.
Right.
Yeah, and Hewitt had this notion of, well, what if we put our big stars together? And it didn't work. Murrow during the war had tried to hire Cronkite from United Press. He raided United Press all the time. Collingwood, Downs, Hodelet, Smith, they all came from United Press. And he tried to hire Cronkite, and Cronkite took that to UP, and they gave him a $25 raise. So he told Murrow no, and Murrow never forgave him, never forgot that. So when they were finally together in the television age at CBS, they were polite to one another on the air, but off air it was very icy. And they didn't get along at all. People saw them at parties and it looked like they were going to have a duel. It's kind of scary. Yes?
Given that Murrow seemed to seek out controversy as he did, why did he wait till 1954 to take on McCarthy?
Yeah, he had done, on the radio, he'd blast him away, you know, and they all did. Severide lost 2 sponsored radio programs giving McCarthy hell. And so they were very bold on radio. On television, they'd kind of danced around it. Murrow did a couple of preliminary programs about McCarthyism. One on a Air Force lieutenant named Milo Radulovich, who had lost his security clearance and was going to lose his commission because of associations with the wrong people. The wrong people being his father and his sister. His father's great offense was reading a Serbian language newspaper. He was from Serbia, why wouldn't he, you know? And his sister had walked a picket line. So they were going to take his commission away, and Murrow did a program about it, and the Air Force did the right thing, ultimately. But nothing directly on McCarthy until McCarthy, one of McCarthy's people got a hold of Joe Wershba, who was on the See It Now staff, and passed a warning on to Murrow through Wershba that you know, he shouldn't be doing these types of programs. That's when Murrow decided, all right, from now on we film everything the guy does, every speech he makes, every hearing he holds, and so they were kind of late getting around to it in 1954. Newspaper people, a lot of columnists, the Alsop brothers, for example, had been hammering at McCarthy. There were a lot of others, but television's a different sort of animal. You know, it's just whatever you do on that, and that particular program showed the power of television, I think, to do either good or evil, depending on how you look at it. It just has, it shows you the impact that a television indictment of someone carries, much greater than anything said on radio or written in a newspaper. You could read, see, Murrow's objection to McCarthy was not that he was anti-communist, it was his methods, the bullying, the lack of due process, the just tap dancing on the Constitution. That isn't what we were about. And that was his focus. Now you could say all that in the newspaper and people would say, oh yeah. But when you see film for the first time of McCarthy bullying witnesses, and you can imagine yourself in that witness chair, and then you see, your outrage factor is much greater. So anyway, yeah, he was accused of being late. But, you know, McCarthy started in 1954 above 50% in the polls. And after this program and his own Army hearings, he couldn't even get 50% of the Senate.
Did McCarthy, I mean, did Murrow ever wind up interviewing Welch after the hearings were over?
I don't know. I don't know. I think it was ABC that carried the hearings.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah. So, yes.
Yes, when you interviewed people who had met or worked with Murrow, did they relate stories that made you surprised or revealed different aspects of his personality that you didn't expect?
Yeah, and some I didn't talk to in time. I did this program on a stage in Fairfield, Connecticut with Richard C. Hoddle, who's the last remaining wartime Murrow reporter. And I said, in front of hundreds of people, I said, well, Dick, did I get it right, you know, that he had these dark moods and these long silences, and Hoddle had said, I didn't know that guy at all. The guy I knew was, you know, told great stories, laughed all the time. Oh, thanks, Dick, that's good. We should have talked a little earlier. No, actually, I did have him read the manuscript ahead of time, and he was very helpful. In fact, he caught one of those tapes. Recording. Yeah, it was a recording. I actually said recording, but it could not have been a recording. Murrow was somewhere in the 30s to arrange a live broadcast and not a recording, and I had to record. Yes?
I've read varying things, but I'm not quite sure of the circumstances exact. Maybe you could further explain is why Shire and Murrow had such a falling out.
Oh, yeah, that was terrible.
Shire really, I mean, what I read about it, he was very, especially after Murrow died, he was saying all sorts
Yeah,
of stories.
went to his grave thinking that Murrow had sabotaged his career. Well, you know, I can't know, because I couldn't interview either one of them. So what I did was just retell both accounts. Shirer felt that he was being censored, that he was losing his sponsored broadcast because of his liberal views. And Murrow thought that Shirer had gotten lazy and wasn't doing the legwork. You know, he was just kind of coasting on his reputation, which was considerable, particularly after, you know, Berlin Diary was such a bestseller. And other Murrow people thought that too. I think Severide and maybe Smith. I mentioned whoever it really was in there. They thought he was getting kind of lazy too. But what is a fact is that the Menon company withdrew its sponsorship. And there was a huge difference between a sponsored broadcast and an unsponsored broadcast, a sustaining program. Huge financial. And then Shirer was manipulative in a bit. He announced on the air it was going to be his last broadcast, and instantly reporters appeared. Now, did he arrange that? It seems odd that these reporters suddenly appeared at the end of his broadcast. So there was a little bit of the, you know, Paley thought there was too much gamesmanship on Shirer's part.
There were even pickets on behalf of
Shire. Yeah, there were demonstrations.
Why did he feel that Murrow was more responsible than Paley?
Because, I don't know, because Murrow, he thought Murrow was jealous. He thought that since Berlin Diary had done so much better than This Is London, which was Murrow's book of wartime broadcasts, he thought, you know, you know, Murrow was getting back at him that way. Anyway, Murrow and Shirer came to some kind of agreement, patching it up, and they were going to keep him on. But by that point, Paley had had enough and wouldn't allow the deal to go through and wanted Shirer out of there. That's a good thing, I guess, because Shirer went off and wrote The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich and wrote some great memoirs, some other memoirs that I read and interviewed him about, and I'm glad he had the freedom to write all that, the free time to write all that.
Do you know anything about how Murrow got into doing Hear It Now?
Yes. Fred Friendly, wanted to do some records using tape or whatever they had, recordings of Churchill and Roosevelt. These would be recordings about the Depression and the war years and all. And he was discussing this with Murrow's agent. And Murrow's agent said, well, why don't you get Murrow to narrate it for you? And that was the beginning of their collaboration. It began with phonograph records, which were called I Can Hear It Now. And from that came a radio series of weekly programs called Hear It Now. And then we did that for about 6 months before they got into television and had See It Now. So it was records, then briefly radio, and then See It Now.
Now, Hear It Now was basically a weekly wrap-up of the news.
Right.
With sound effects and so on
Yeah.
and so forth, and little interviews and stuff. And that's a little bit different. It's not quite the transition to See It Now. That's kind of a different flavor, isn't it?
I suppose, and
See It Now was more interviews or something.
well, no, it was
Or
everything.
focus on an issue.
It was a magazine. I mean, it did a bunch of things. They went to Korea, for example. They would have a speech by Churchill that recorded somewhere. They would have a college debate. They did a variety of things. It was a mishmash. It was original reporting, and it was Murrow doing a commentary at the end, and it didn't have a set format. It could be anything they wanted it to be.
And I guess it was the first broadcast where they showed the East and West Coast.
On the first program, they did that.
And the guy in the background was Don Hewitt.
Right, he was the director, the studio director. And that technology had not existed just a month before. They couldn't have done that shot. They had a monitor. Murrow was in the control room, and he says, on this monitor you see the Golden Gate Bridge and San Francisco Bay, and then the monitor right next to it was another live shot of the Brooklyn Bridge and New York Harbor. So they had these two coasts adjacent to one another in live shots. And they were just showing off. Look what we can do. Because a month earlier you couldn't have done that. They had just laid the cable. Yes, ma'am.
Would you talk a little bit about your experience broadcasting in Korea?
Well, I was in the Army in Vietnam, in the Vietnam era, and I lucked out. The computer sent me to Korea. And I saluted and said, yes, sir. Because I don't think I would have lasted 30 seconds in Nam. I'm a big, slow, clumsy, white target. And when I was drafted, I said, I do radio. And I thought, what the Army would do is, radio, huh? Here, put this on your back. And of course, they're the guys that go first. They see the antenna and they blow out your communications. So. No, but it all worked out. I had a great time. I did the 2 o'clock radio news all over Korea, and then at night I did the television news, and just had a great time.
That was Armed Forces Radio?
Yeah. Yeah, I did, Huh?
Any of that been recorded?
Oh, yeah, there might be. On what was it, like a 2-inch tape or something like that, big, oh. Anyway, I get embarrassed hearing myself.
Can you tell us a little about your new show?
It's going to be interviews. Don't expect Morning Edition with that army of people that put that together, Sylvia Poggioli won't be there. There are only, at the moment, there are only 6 of us on the staff. We hope to have a couple of more. And what we can do is interviews. So I'm trying to get the candidates, of course, for the first program, not just because there's an election, but I want a little attention, I want to tell people this program is there, so that would be a way of doing that. So who knows, but there'll be a lot of music interviews, obviously, because I work in a jukebox now. You've got all these music channels, and performers are always there. passing through, being interviewed for these various channels. So you just grab them and interview them for your program. You know? Oh, there's Peter, Paul, and Mary. I'll talk to them. And that's exactly what I did.
These aren't live.
No, but there'll be live components too. I'm just banking them now, so I'll have something. I don't want to be naked, going on.
Now, some of the channels have commercials, and some of them
No.
don't.
No.
No, they're all commercials.
No, the only commercials you hear are in the television feeds, like Fox or, we run Fox audio, and you hear commercials in that.
So you will be totally supported by...
It's public radio. It's just, basically. Yeah. Instead of you pledging $10 a month, you'll be billed.
Radio finally takes the cable.
That's right. But it's still public radio. I mean, the whole channel I'm on is public radio programs. It's This American Life, Studio 360, The Connection, Only a Game, all these programs out of PRI and WBUR in Boston. It just won't be NPR programs.
They don't get Prairie Home Companion.
No, I don't.
They do have As It Happens.
Yes,
That was
that's right, CBC's too.
Why-
The NPR has an arrangement with XM's rival, Sirius Satellite Radio. So you hear NPR programs on there, but you do not hear Morning Edition or All Things Considered. So.
Bob, whose idea was it for you to have the casual chats with Red Barber?
When we started Morning Edition, we had designated segments. So we had 2 sports segments every day, and no tradition of covering sports. So we filled them with commentators, at the beginning at least. And so we're always scouting around for commentators. And the first sports producer of Morning Edition was Quetzal Levine. And she had done an interview with Red for Black History Month, because Red had been at the microphone, of course, when Jackie Robinson broke the color line. And she was so impressed by Red and that energy and that just engaging personality that he had, that she invited him to be on every week.
Did you have any idea what he was going to talk about?
I thought we were going to, stroll down memory lane. I thought it was going to be nostalgia. And I didn't realize that he's kind of adamant about not living in the past, that he wanted to tell you about his life now, and his life then was retirement in Florida. So he would tell me about what was growing in his garden and what the cat was doing and how the squirrels were getting into the bird feeder. And people loved this. And they sent in designs for bird feeders that the squirrels couldn't get into. From all over America came these elaborate, multicolored charts, and the people just loved him.
You did a great job. You should take that.
Well, I'd been Susan Stamberg's straight man on All Things Considered. So I knew how to do that. But no, and at the beginning of that, I was petrified because he was such a legend, and I was used to scripted radio, not the spontaneity of a conversation with Red. So he helped me out a lot by, I think I couldn't have handled something like 9/11, some a deadly serious thing, unless I had been schooled in just ad-lib radio through Red. I think he made me a much better broadcaster. Because I was just hanging on. I didn't know where this thing was going.
So grab all those musicians and pass them through there and do the same thing.
Yeah. So I'll sign books now, and thank you all. Back here, up here? Oh, you want your mic back?
Thanks.
Yeah, I thought I was going to get out of here with that.
Almost. Okay, thank you.
You bet.
I'll get you a copy. Huh? I'll get you a copy.